Sorry for being slow, but that's what happens when you go skiing with your 5-year-old. So we want to speak about the future of spoken audio, and a space in which a lot of innovation has happened. And obviously, spoken audio is particularly driven by podcasts, but spoken audio is more than just podcasts, and hence I'm really happy that we have a panel here together that is actually representing how broad spoken audio can be. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few statistics with you. So over the next 3 to 5 years, we will have 200 million smart speaker devices in the US, which is a lot considering you have 300 million people there. Podcast listening has passed 50% of the US population. 25% of Americans listen weekly. 8% of the 25 to 34-year-old total listening time goes to podcasts in the UK, and 18% of all the listening on smartphones are spoken audio formats. So this is there's a lot happening in that space, and I think we should get started by talking about the content you produce or you provide, to see the broad space you are active in. So, June, why don't you start? What is the content you produce or provide? Who are your listeners? When do they listen to your content?
Sure. So, Christian, what I thought I could start on just quickly is, since I'm representing the sort of the podcasting end of this panel, is that in the U.S. in particular right now, we're in the middle of a renaissance in podcasting, and it's not just a tech boom. It is a true renaissance of the audio storytelling form that we haven't seen since the dawn of radio, and it's quite extraordinary to watch it. I think what's underneath it is the pervasiveness, as you said, Christian, of the devices, the smartphones, smart speakers, connected cars. But what really sparked it in the US, and I think this is really interesting for this audience, is not the technology, but the content. So the podcasting renaissance in the US was completely sparked by 2 podcasts that came out several years ago, both of extraordinary quality. One of them was Serial, the true crime drama from This American Life, and the other was Startup, the very first podcast from Gimlet Media, the first startup in the podcasting space. And that extraordinary content was the spark that allowed this podcasting renaissance to happen just over the past several years, and it's been truly exciting to watch it play out. For my own content, so my co-founder Darren Triff and I had spent a combined 17 years at TED, launching TED Talks, TED.com, TED Radio Hour. We left a few years ago to start our own media company, a media invention company. And as we set out to do it, we wanted to create the kind of content that could transcend different formats, different media platforms. And we were drawn to podcasting first because of that renaissance that was happening and the opportunity in it. And our strategy going in was to create content of just the highest originality, the highest production values, which again, I think speaks to everyone in this audience who have such a devotion to the form of storytelling. And it really works in podcasting now. So we believe that is what allows our podcast to break out. The podcasts we have super quickly there's 3 of them that we've launched in the last 2 years. One is Masters of Scale. Some of you may have come across it. It's a business podcast hosted by Reid Hoffman. That doesn't sound like any other big business podcast. Another is Meditative Story, which combines immersive storytelling with mindfulness prompts to help you feel recharged. We're doing a listening experience for that after this panel in the deep dive room. People, our listeners, we think are, from what we can tell, are primarily listening on their smartphones. To a certain extent, also in connected cars. They listen largely, we believe, during their commutes and during their workouts, and also while they're doing household chores that they can't, where their hands are in use. So while they're cleaning, while they're cooking, these are all the use cases they tell us. What our data tells us is that commuting And both from the time and the length is that commuting and workouts are likely the primary use cases. Masters of Scale, no matter how long our episodes are, our listeners listen for 30 minutes. Almost every episode of every length is listened to for just about 30 minutes, which drives forward that commute use case. Also interesting compared to the last panel, we don't see a short attention span in podcasting. You actually see a long attention span. People want that longer content. And I think at that point I'll leave it there. So that's the thing I left out. Sorry, just one thing is that we actually really believe that as an independent media company, this originality and quality is what makes us break out, and it bears out in our numbers. So our podcasts have been listened to more than 30 million times in the last 2 years. They bring in millions of dollars in revenue for us.
Yeah. Thank you, June. Marcus, you are also active in the spoken audio world, but you have created your own audio system. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I founded the company Boxine, which is basically the product Tony on Tonybox, which is very famous here in Germany and probably also across Europe. For us from US and other countries, I brought this device that actually is a new audio system for kids between 2 and 10 years old. And we have done this for our own kids because we thought there is no appropriate audio system and player for kids in that age that they could operate in the digital age very good. So what we do is you take this, kid could take a figurine and put it on top of this audio cube, and then if you get this mic, please, I think
hit the button.
Okay. And if you remove it, it stops, and if you put it down, it starts again. And you could reduce the volume by pressing the small ears for reducing the volume. This is for higher, and you could spool another track by clapping here. So you see, this is we are much into kids audio content, and this is designed for kids because we believe that small kids don't know what is about a plastic button for going forward, but they know what is a small ear that might be reducing the volume. And so it's a lot of into haptic. We are based in Düsseldorf, and we are doing actually in the digital age hardware based from Düsseldorf, which is also kind of unique. And and we have, of course, a lot of content. We have meanwhile 250 of those different figurines, large licenses, and we are having 1.4 million of this box in kids' rooms, so that we have a device which could provide good content to kids.
And you are about to expand into the US with your product, right? As I understand.
Yes, we are trying to hit the US market end of this year. So there's a lot of things to do.
So an own smart speaker system for kids. Until,
but we don't have a microphone.
When
you had this number, so smart speakers with a microphone, this has no microphone on purpose. So we're coming more for the point that kids in that age should really concentrating on listening. We believe that audio listening to good stories is very, very important for kids, as well as having a 3D haptic. So every kid at 2 years could wipe into an iPad. But I think it's also important to have something kind of 3D figurines and that they control by themselves.
Fantastic, Matt. I want maybe some of you who know Skillshare might have wondered what is Matt Cooper doing on the spoken audio panel when he's actually providing.
Wait, is this a spoken audio panel?
No.
When he's
the
providing online video learning learning content. But there's an interesting observation you have actually in the use case of your videos, right?
Yeah. So we, as you mentioned, we're primarily video-based. Actually, 100%. Primarily meaning 100%. 100% video-based content at this point. So we have about 20,000 classes focused on a wide range of creative skills, design, illustration, photography, lifestyle, interior design, watercolor. And one of the things we've noticed. 20% of our unique users have watched a class on background on their mobile.
So as an audio learning.
They're going audio only. And so as we look at all the trends and we're seeing all the statistics that you're seeing, we're in a constant battle to keep people's attention. So whether it's WaitWhat or Netflix or Spotify or going to the gym or just staring out the window and doing nothing, we are ultimately competing for time. So if there are ways that we can make our content and sort of our learning structure more amenable to things when you're not sitting in front of your desktop and you don't have your hands free and you don't have your stylus in front of you, obviously that increases engagement, allows us to deliver value in a different way.
Right. And we need to talk about distribution, obviously. So how you get actually the content out there. And obviously, there's a lot of competition. You know, we have many podcasts out there, and there's a lot of content. June, you know, why do you think? You know, maybe we look at it from two aspects. You know, one is obviously, why do you think is the second wave of podcasts? Podcasts or spoken audio formats is nothing new. I mean, the technology has been around for a while. But the second wave seems to be much more successful than the first one. So what do you think is, you know, are the drivers for that? And then the second is obviously, how do you make sure that, you know, your content is actually, you know, downloaded in millions?
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting, right? Because in the first wave of podcasting, which was when the iPod first came out, which is how it became called a podcast. That was around 2004, 2005, and it's interesting because that was the start of it, and that space in the US was immediately filled either by professional radio shows from NPR or the phenomenon of the two people in the garage with a microphone, which really dominated podcasting for many years. And it's interesting because right at the moment it came out was the same moment that online video started to take off, and YouTube really created that container through which online video was able to get momentum and take off. And Apple Podcasts has really played that role in the podcast space. Several years back, they started paying a lot more attention to how do they cultivate that audience and the container in which podcasts can ultimately thrive. So when we think about distribution on the podcast side, it largely happens through devices, not through, I don't know why this was my sign for the web, but through a laptop. The Apple is still the dominant player by far. Like, depending on whose numbers you believe, Apple is 70 or 80% of the market, but that's starting to change. And so there's a lot of really interesting competition happening, both from Spotify, to a certain extent from Pandora, and a lot of startup podcast players in the US. So we're starting to see those smaller players like Overcast and Castbox and Stitcher start to take 5 or 6% of the market share each. So that's great for content providers, we think, because it gives us a lot of different places to play and then a lot of different places to build audience. I'd say that the one most important thing that we've learned in building audiences for our podcasts, and Christian knows this very well because we talk about it all the time, is the importance of the launch period. And launches are always launches are important in any media, but they are really important in podcasting because the algorithms really were designed for movies and TV shows, movies and music rather. And so they really look a lot at like that first weekend and the first week, and that's where you have the momentum and you can drive up the charts. And that's really where we have found that almost the entire game is won, or not the entire game, but you really get a strong advantage by launching strong on those platforms with a lot of momentum, because it looks at velocity of how many people you attract in those first weeks, and then how much they're rating you and how long they're listening, but primarily focusing on that launch. And I'm smiling as I look at Christian, because with Burda as one of our investors, we're constantly reaching out to our investors and all of our friends, family, audience for that moment around the first launch.
Great. Marcus, you know, your distribution strategy is slightly different, right?
Yeah, it's completely different because we developed on purpose a closed system. So we have our own system. We have the 215 figurines. We are launching every month 8 new figurines. So it took 70 weeks to do a new one. And then we have, interestingly, shipping 90% to stationary retailers. So 4,000 in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Ireland. So it's really completely different distribution. So we license the content, by the way, from known publishers. Here's a famous Disney, but there is also Universal, Sony, large ones, but small ones. So it's a huge license business, but we control everything, and we are delivering the content in our system. As we now have 1.5 million boxes there in the kids' rooms, of course, it's obviously a bit easier. But this is really complete our system. But I love to have a podcast, Tony, from you and the box, because the box is connected, so the content comes through a really cloud system, and so we could easily have also a nice podcast on it.
You have a little Guy Raz figurine that you put on.
Yeah. Imagine you have I think again a different approach, right? Obviously, coming from video.
Yeah. So I mean, we are basically the distributor for our teachers. So it's an open platform. Anybody can come in and teach. We have 8,000 experts from all over the world teaching, kind of their core domain expertise. So as we think about moving into audio, how can we be the distributor for those experts to teach their same skills but convey it through a different format? So we produce 4 to 6 Skillshare originals where we have a production team that films the class, works with the expert. They tend to be bigger name influencers in their area. We're going to start experimenting this year with creating our own audio content, distributing that through our platform, kind of figure out what the right formula is, but then how do we get some of our best teachers to start experimenting with that format alongside us? Because we're seeing all the trends as well, but we're actually seeing a lot of the shorter form content on our platform tends to take hold. And again, if you're competing for time, a 5 to 10 minute segment is easier to digest than an hour. And given how much of our content right now is consumed in front of the desktop, going shorter and going more mobile seems to be a good move for us. So we're kind of thinking about how do we become the distribution play for those teachers and that expertise, but just in an audio format instead of a video format.
Great. Interest of time, let's talk about the future of spoken audio. And coming back to the DLD theme, what are you adding to the future of the spoken audio industry?
Yeah, for us, it's really shifting towards that educational content. So you're seeing more and more sort of dedicated educational podcasts pop up. There's now a conference dedicated to only sort of sound and audio-based education. So how do we start to adapt? A lot of the success of existing podcasts has been more narrative, has been more storytelling. We see the same formula work in our video-based classes. The best classes have a story to them, and it doesn't matter whether you're learning creative lifestyle, sort of putting yourself in a Crane mindset, or brand strategy, or Adobe shortcuts. If there's a narrative arc, it's tougher from, my accounting class doesn't have much of a narrative arc to it, but if you can get it into that format, it tends to drive more engagement and more stickiness. So how do we adapt shorter form educational, but also still carry that narrative and storytelling component to it?
Great. Marcus, in your case?
I'm a very strong believer in increasing audio, because the reason why we decided to go to the US is not only because a strategic thing from competition, but also that you see increasingly audio things ongoing on streaming. Podcast is also not so popular but I'm a heavy podcast user, and podcast is really growing heavily also in Germany. And you have meanwhile also the technology is also there. They use also a bit more audio. My content is always there, but look I think the book industry where we deal a lot with, they claim or said once in an article that the car industry is guilty that they don't selling enough audio CDs anymore because they remove simply the CD player out of cars. But on the other hand, they have a lot of very well new technology which could connect you to easily to access to kind of other content which is available in the internet, podcasts or others. So and Spotify and Audible and other companies, they're going globally with audio content. And so I'm a strong believer that audio content and audio is growing over the next years heavily beyond podcast. But you need to always have the appropriate systems where you are in the car or in the kids' room to listen to this content.
Great. And June, how do you look at it?
But I do love the provocative question of what are you adding? So in the U.S. podcast market, I believe we have something like 800,000 podcasts already, most of which are still that model of the two people in the garage. But increasingly, we are still really at the dawn of this as a new medium, and there are so many categories of content that haven't been hit. There's still so much to do. So with everything that we add, we think about how do we create something that is truly inventive, truly creative, highest production values that meets a need that perhaps people don't even know they had. I think our best example of that is our new podcast, Meditative Story, which we had launched with Ariane Huffington's company, Thrive Global. I'll do another pitch. We're going to do a deep dive of it as a listening experience after this in the Steelcase room, but bring your headsets. And what's really interesting to us now looking internationally is that country by country, in Germany and elsewhere, in Europe in particular, you have all of the ingredients there for a renaissance in podcasting, and the market's waiting for that breakout original podcast that someone really invests in. And so we're really watching for that, and also would really be interested to add to that for anyone who might be looking for a partner. Look to us.
Yeah,
there's some really interesting creative work to be done.
Yeah, thank you, June. I think innovation will continue in the spoken audio world, and June and Darren had a great idea to actually not just talk about spoken audio, but also bring it to life. So they would like to invite you to the Stahl case, to a unique sort of first of its kind listening experience, group listening experience. So bring your smartphones, headsets, and what are we listening to?
We are listening to one of our recent episodes of Meditative Story, a beautiful piece by Keith Yamashita, who many people here I think will know that it's the one we found it's the most striking example of what we're trying to create.
Great. So I encourage you to come over. It's right after the panel. Thank you so much for coming, June, Marcus, and Matt, and thank you so much for listening.